A lot of billionaires call themselves self-made, and technically they're not lying. They just leave out the part where self-made started with a $2 million loan from dad, a paid-off house, or a family business already doing $8 million a year. Self-made means you didn't inherit the whole fortune. It does not mean you started at zero. And that difference is the entire myth this video is about. I want to grant something first, because it's true. Some of these people are genuinely brilliant. They work 80-hour weeks, they took real risk, they built something that didn't exist before. Hard work is a real ingredient in almost every one of these stories. I'm not saying Bezos or Musk did nothing, but the starting line was not the same for them as it was for you, and pretending otherwise is where the myth does its damage. Effort matters. It just isn't the variable that explains the gap between someone earning $60,000 a year and someone worth $60 billion. That gap is not a million times more effort because nobody works a million times harder than anyone else. There are only 24 hours in the day for both of you. Something else is doing that math, and it's not grit. So here's the mechanism, and it starts before the person even has an idea worth funding. Starting capital changes what risk means at the most basic level. If you have $10 million in family money behind you, a failed startup costs you a couple years and some pride. You try again next quarter with a clean slate. If you have $0 behind you, that same failure costs you your rent, your credit score, and maybe your family's house if you used it as collateral. That's not a mindset difference between the two founders. That's a math difference. And it's the reason venture capital overwhelmingly flows to people who already have a financial cushion, because a cushion is what lets someone survive being wrong. Look at where the first checks actually come from for most startups before any VC gets involved. It's called a friends and family round for a reason. And if your friends and family don't have $50,000 or $100,000 lying around, you simply don't have that round. You have a good idea and no way to test it. Then there's what happens once the money exists, because keeping it and growing it is its own separate mechanism. The average American worker pays a higher effective tax rate on their wages than a lot of billionaires pay on their wealth gains. Wages get taxed the moment you earn them, every 2 weeks, automatically. Unrealized stock gains don't get taxed at all until you sell, so the wealthy simply don't sell. Instead, they borrow against their stock at 2 to 4% interest, live off the loan, buy the house and the boat, and pay the staff with borrowed money, and never trigger a taxable event because a loan isn't income. Then when they die, the asset's cost basis resets to its current value under what's called stepped-up basis, and decades of gains just disappear for tax purposes, inherited by the kids completely clean. It's called buy, borrow, die, and it's not a loophole they stumbled into. It's a strategy built directly into the tax code. And it only works if you already have enough appreciating assets to borrow against, which loops right back to needing that starting capital in the first place. Now put a number on what that actually does over one lifetime, because the compounding is where it gets absurd. Say someone inherits $5 million at age 25 and just parks it in an index fund averaging 7% a year after inflation, doing nothing else. By 65, that's worth around $75 million without a single day of running a business. Compare that to someone starting at $0 at 25, saving an aggressive $10,000 a year for 40 years at that same 7% return. That person ends up with roughly $2 million. Both of them worked 40 years. Both of them made smart, disciplined financial decisions. But one of them is 37 times wealthier purely because of where the clock started, not because of what either person did with their time. That's not a talent gap. That's a 40-year head start compounding silently in the background while everyone talks about hustle. And this is where it stops being an abstract chart and starts being personal, because most people are living the second scenario, not the first. You do the math on your own paycheck, you save what you can, you make the responsible choice at every fork in the road, and you still watch the gap widen every single year. Because the gap was never about your choices to begin with. It's not that you're bad with money, it's that you're playing the same game against someone who got 40 extra years of runway before you even opened your first bank account. Here's the part nobody says out loud, and it's the uncomfortable one. The system isn't broken, it's working exactly as designed, because the rules around capital gains, stepped up basis, and carried interest weren't written by accident. They were lobbied for, line by line, over decades, by people who directly benefit from them. That's regulatory capture. And it's not a conspiracy theory, it's just how tax policy actually gets written in this country. Writing a tax exemption into law costs money in lawyers and lobbyists and campaign contributions. And the people with $10 million to spend on that get a seat at the table. The person making $22 an hour does not get that seat, doesn't get a meeting, doesn't get a phone call returned. So the loophole isn't a bug some accountant found by accident in 2019. It's a feature somebody paid to install in the tax code decades ago, and then paid again every few years to keep it there whenever Congress considered closing it. Look at what this does to labor while all of that is happening, because the same mechanism shows up directly in your paycheck. Since the early 1970s, worker productivity in this country has risen somewhere around 80%. Real wages adjusted for inflation went up a small fraction of that over the same 50 years. That gap didn't just evaporate. It went somewhere specific, into corporate profit margins, into stock buybacks, into executive compensation packages. And that pool of money is exactly what funds the starting capital and the buy, borrow, die machine for the next generation. You producing more value for your employer than you did 10 years ago was never automatically going to show up in your check. That was a choice about who keeps the difference between what you produce and what you're paid, made by people who also write the tax rules governing what happens to that difference once they've kept it. Now here's a second walkthrough, because the mechanism shows up in small business too, not just tech startups and inheritance. Take two people who both want to open a coffee shop needing $150,000 to start. One of them has a parent who co-signs the SBA loan and covers the first 6 months of rent if sales come in slow, which lenders factor into the risk. She gets approved at a reasonable rate within weeks. The other has no one to co-sign, gets denied by 2 banks, and ends up financing through a merchant cash advance instead, which can carry the equivalent of 40 to 80% annualized interest once you do the math on the fees. Same idea, same location quality, same hours worked behind the counter. But one of them is expanding to a second location in year 3. The other is still paying down the debt from opening the first one. That's not a difference in coffee. That's a difference in what capital was available to absorb the exact same kind of risk. This is what it does to a person living the second version of either story. It makes you doubt decisions that were actually fine because the scoreboard says you're losing while you did everything right on paper. It leads to comparing your progress to people who started the race 40 yards ahead and quietly calling yourself slow for it. It leads to blaming your own spending, your own coffee habit, your own $6 a day, when the real gap was a $5 million head start compounding at 7% a year while you weren't even born yet. It leads to taking on debt at 60% effective interest just to get a shot someone else got handed at 6%. None of that is a personal failure. That's a structural fact getting misdiagnosed as a personal one over and over by people who directly benefit from you believing it's you. What I actually think should change is simple, and none of it is radical. Tax unrealized gains above some real threshold instead of letting them sit untaxed forever. Close the stepped-up basis loophole so death stops functioning as a tax strategy. Stop pretending a system that lets someone borrow at 3% against assets that have never once been taxed is the same system a wage earner operates inside every 2 weeks. None of that punishes success. It just asks the game to admit what it actually is, out loud, instead of letting self-made do the work of hiding it. What I did with that information was simpler than any policy fix. I stopped trying to out-hustle a head start because you cannot out-hustle math no matter how many hours you put in. I put money into assets on a fixed schedule instead of waiting to feel ready because time in the market is the one piece of this compounding I actually control, even starting from zero. It won't make me a billionaire. It was never going to. It's supposed to close the gap by the size of my own effort, not the size of someone else's inheritance. So when you hear self-made, ask the only question that actually matters. Self-made? From what starting point? Over how many years? With how much of a cushion behind them if it all went wrong? That question is the whole video. Everything else is just the story they'd rather you believe instead.